let me tell you briefly what I think I'm going to be doing during the next few minutes. And I think the best way to show it, let me share the screen with you. Let me share here the screen with all of you. I hope it's clear here. Is basically what I'm going to do is provide an account of my views about development today. And I think nothing better than using Don Quixote to clearly, really the analogy of this is what I think about development. These are decades of work in the field. So many of the things is about I see giants and I don't see windmills. This is my view, very, very personal. So keep this in mind. Of course, disagreements are allowed, and but this is my views after almost 30 years working in this area. Today, most of the time I will wear my hat as practitioner, much more than academic. This is not a technical presentation. It's not about very little modeling, etc. It's about my reflections about. You see, I landed in Asia in 1989. It's already slightly over 30 years. I joined ADB, as Antonio was saying, in 1996. For you to keep in mind, to understand, this was 3 years after the World Bank published the East Asian Miracle Report, extremely controversial. I will talk about it. And this was about 1 year before the East Asian financial crisis. I was a very junior staff in the bank, and I was sent on a mission to Thailand, the first mission that the bank had to Thailand in September 1997. It was quite an experience for me. So most of what I'm going to talk about and most of my knowledge about development comes through the lens of Asia. I know very little about Latin America. What I know is for obvious reasons. I'm from Spain, cultural affinity. I have visited El Salvador, Honduras. I've done some work with on Costa Rica, but much less than Asia, and certainly very little of Africa. A couple of years ago, I visited Namibia. I was invited by the central bank to give a talk. So you will see as the talk progresses, most of my conversation is going to be about Asia. All right. So let me get to the presentation, and let me do something that is very dear to me. Also, let me show you, for those of you who do not know, this must be very similar to what happens in many other countries. This is Manila. Okay, this is Manila today. All right, this is the garbage. This is Manila. I see this every day. This is Manila, and this is Manila. And I see this every single day, okay? I'm sure that those of you from developing countries who have visited them are familiar with it. This was the Manila I knew when I joined ADB. This is the area where the bank is located. This is what it looked like when I joined the bank in 1996. I'm gonna show you now what this exactly the same area looks like today. This is what we call Ortigas. If I hadn't shown you the 3 photographs before, you would say this is Manhattan, this is London, this is Munich, it is any city in an advanced economy. Okay, this is an area called Bonifacio Global City, where I live 15 years in the late 1990s. You see there is absolutely nothing there. This is what this area looks like today in a matter of 20 years, less than 20 years, what it has become. This, okay? So this is where I live. This is the way I understand development. This has been my life for a long, long time. So what I'm going to do now is to start by telling you, by summarizing, you know, in 5 bullet points, what I'm going to develop, the themes that I'm going to develop as I go and talk. All right. What I call my beliefs, and this will permeate the whole presentation. Number 1, historically, development has been and will continue being, will remain a very long process. So whoever believes that development is a question of 10 years is absolutely wrong, okay? Number 2, for me, the crucial development problem is a question of employment and structural transformation along the lines that I will develop. Is about sending people out of some sectors into some other sectors, what we call a structural transformation. That is the quintessential problem of development. Number 3, Bill Easterly's White Man's Burden. Yes, I have seen it. Definitely, I have seen it clearly, very, very, very clearly. Number 4, development with capital letters. This is big development. Without the state as a propeller and coordinator, I have no idea what that is. Sincerely, I'm all ears. All right. Whoever thinks that a development can happen without a state, simply no, not true. That's my 30 years experience. All right. And number 5, tremendously poor understanding of what development is about. So these are the themes that I'm going to develop and what I want to put on the table for discussion. So let me talk quickly about these five things, just a couple of slides for you to see what I'm talking about. By the way, the name of this game is what I call here capitalism as an economic, social, and political system. So all this happens into a context. The context is this model that we call economic model in particular that we call capitalism. All right, we can talk about this later. These are some numbers, some figures from a paper that I published in 2017. My co-authors and I estimated that it takes almost 100 years, or it has taken historically about 100 years for countries to traverse what we call the middle income segment. So going from low income into high income, okay? You have here the median number is about, for all economies, 83 years. The East and Southeast Asian economies, which is what distorts the whole picture about the middle income trap, etc., is 33 years. And without East and Southeast Asia, it's almost 100 years. All right. So we documented that the median number of years to go from lower middle income into upper middle income from about 2,000 to 7,000 is about 55 years. And the median number of years to go from upper middle income, that is 7, into about 12,000 is 15 years. In the period that we analyzed is 1950, 2013. So there were 30 countries that have made it, that have traversed the middle income segment and had become high income. It's very, very interesting because there are only 9 economies that did it very quickly. That is the lower middle income segment into upper middle income segment in less than 55 years, and in less than 15 years, upper middle income into high income. And these are Japan, the Fornese, Finland, Ireland, Norway, and Mauritius. And there were 8 economies that did it in above 20, more than 20, 55 years, the lower into upper, and more than 15, the upper into high. And those are Spain, the UK, Argentina. I put here in bold Uruguay to remind myself that this is the longest, 142 years. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US. So if I ask you, we're not face to face, but the first country to achieve $2,000 per capita income that has become a lower middle income in history, I'm going to tell you that was the Netherlands. And that was, it attained it in 1827. How long do you think the Netherlands was that in that segment, the lower middle income segment, that is to get to $7,250? 128 years. That's what it took the Netherlands to go from 2,000 to $7,000. 128 years. So whoever thinks that development is a short story is absolutely wrong, is completely misled by what happened in a very, very small group of economies. This is on the Philippines, the story of structural transformation and employment. Look, this is a very disaggregated data. These are the top occupations in the Philippines, percentage of total employment. Out of 400 occupations, the 26 that I put here in this graph represent 2/3 of total employment in the Philippines. If you take a quick look at what I have here, you will see that most of them are agriculture and what I call bottom services, non-tradables. 2/3 of employment in the Philippines. All right, you will see what is the largest single categories is farmhands and laborers. You will see over 15%. If you add the other blues that you see here in the bars, all of them are agriculture, it comes to about 25%. And you will see that the rest are services that are non-tradable, what I call bottom services. On top of that, you need to add that 16.4% of Filipino employed workers declared themselves as underemployed in 2018. These are people who wanted to work more hours, all right? So what do I think development is a question of creating high productivity activities and send workers out of there, produce what we call in the modern literature complex products, in something that we often people translate is be able to, people forget, is to be able to translate productivity increases into higher wages, not into lower prices, which is what often happens in developing countries. All right, so this is how I conceptualize development. Yeah, I talk here about Bill Easterly's white man's burden, something that I have seen. I'm not really blaming my employer and other development institutions, development agencies for some failures. This mostly refers to what I question is the creation of development experts by multilateral development banks, agencies in six months. This is more what I'm talking about. Everybody who comes to a development institution in 6 months goes around lecturing developing countries. A very, very interesting story. Probably I did that too when I went to Thailand shortly after I joined ADB. Okay. So the story of governments, yes, I completely agree with all of you. Governments are bad, incompetent, inefficient. There are government failures. Policymakers have vested interests. You name it. Put all the list there. But development, I'm convinced after 30 years in this business, is the state's business and responsibility. Without a committed state, it will not happen. In what I am saying, I hope nobody understands me. I'm not talking about planning Soviet style, nothing to do with that. That is why I put here this big caveat that this statement is compatible with saying that in a market economy, of course, the private sector firms do produce, they choose, et cetera, and what they want to do is to supply demand for people like you and me who buy goods and services in the market. I accept that government makes mistakes, and I accept that poor country governments do have a lot of capacity problems. Still, I'm convinced after many years in this business that without a state committed, nothing will happen. Okay. All right. So on the question of development being misunderstood, as you know, all of you, there is a lot of talk about attaining the Millennium Development Goals, going up in the doing business ranking. This appears every single day in my conversations with policymakers. The idea that development is, you look at Sweden today, and that's development. Is absolutely fantastic. Lack of corruption, democracy, great infrastructure. They don't really understand, many people do not understand that Afghanistan does not have a critical mass of modern activities where these things do happen. Lack of corruption, democracy, etc., etc. So big misunderstanding of what development is about. So having said this, the conclusion is, and what I'm going to get in the next few minutes is to tell you why I use the analogy of Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot. For me, development is a story of waiting for Godot. And the thesis that I'm going to put on the table, that this century will be more of the same, that most of the developing countries will continue waiting for Godot during the next, 80 years, because remember, 1/5 of the 21st century is already gone. So don't forget that 20 years are already gone. Okay. So this is going to be more about waiting for Godot. A lot of talk in for the reasons that I'm going to develop. Okay. So convergence, catch up, I really doubt it. I'm going to talk about this towards the end of the presentation. So with this in mind, this is the structure of the presentation. I'm going to start with a quick overview, something that you all know, how development has changed, how the views about development have changed. This could be presented in different ways, but I hope that the way I do it is minimally acceptable to all of you. This is very, very important, because then in the second part, we're going to talk about where we are today. And this is my experience being a practitioner in an institution like mine, and this is number 3. Then I'm going to go into numbers 4 and 5, and I'm going to argue that most developing countries are what I call banana republics today, and they will continue being banana republics in the 21st century. I don't see a clear way out for most of them. And I'm going to conclude on something that I hope is constructive and positive, but what are the options that they have today to move forward. Okay. So let me go into the question of, start about how development, the views of development have changed in what I call the traditional view of development. Okay. So how did the profession understand development for quite some time? And this was after World War II. Basically, if you want even including the Harrod-Domar model of 1939, there was a focus on physical capital accumulation, thought to be the key source of production. All the papers that I mentioned, or big development papers and books at the time written here, these are 1940s, 1950s. All of you are familiar with them. They mentioned different things, but all of them have something in common. And it was the idea that development was viewed as a process of a structural transformation, reallocation of the factors of of production from sectors of low or activities of low productivity into activities of high productivity. Some authors thought about the possibility of a big push in industry, education, and agriculture. These were the years of Keynesianism, which of course had a lot to do with what I'm talking about. The Harrod-Domar model that was used to estimate capital requirements. Okay, so this is how authors were thinking at the time. A lot of state action. Okay, there was a mistrust of markets in many countries. Import substitution. Remember, institutions like mine and the World Bank were set up after World War II to deal with the foreign exchange constraint. Right, absolutely fundamental. That's what they did for a lot of decades. And there was a lot of trust in the governments, in the ability of the governments to really take countries, developing countries, which had they were coming from a lot of the centuries, in some cases, of colonialism in the 1930s, the Depression. So they believed that there were market failures and the governments could do it. These ideas were prevalent all of the developing world. Latin America, for example, it was the work or Raúl Prebisch's work on the context of pessimism about the possibility of pursuing developing countries, pursuing export development led growth, the long-run tendency to decline of the prices of raw materials. There was a lot of this during this decade. I know that I'm going really fast because I presume that all this is very, very familiar to all of you. What happened sometimes around the 1970s, that all this way of thinking about development and progress really came to a complete halt in approximately the late 60s, early 70s, and there were tremendous changes in development thinking and in general economic thinking between the 1970s and the 1990s. First of all, Keynesian economic thinking suffered a serious blow, and with it the idea that governments could lead development. Okay. Second, there was a series of schools of thought that advocated a much lesser role for government. And number three, the realities that there were examples of countries across the world that show that well, this question of market failure, well, there were a lot of government failures, price distortions, and rent seeking. There was a lot of this. Plenty of new ideas. There was the idea of going back to getting the prices right, reduce government intervention, etc. The public choice revolution, that civil servants do have their own vested interest, rational expectations, so that by the 1980s, many economists had completely reconsidered the idea of public intervention. All these in the 1990s came to new classical macroeconomics that included ideas of rational expectations and the natural theories of unemployment. Inflation targeting came to all central banks, and the endogenous growth models. This is when I was in grad school, late 80s, early 90s. Development came, no, it was Robert Lucas and Paul Romer, increasing returns and externalities. It was impossible to talk about development without talking about Lucas and Romer. They were the ones who knew about development. But what was the issue? The issue is that these ideas totally permeated development thinking. And they were, I don't know exactly whether it was adopted, accepted, or imposed on developing countries' policymakers. In my view, my feeling is that it was a combination of all these things, that much of this came from development institutions, but much of it came from, I'm sure, students from developing countries who got a PhD in certain universities, and they came back home. They were simply reproducing what was going on in these universities, right or wrong. But this has been my experience in analyzing or seeing what people do. Okay. The reality of government intervention, after what I was saying, is that many countries that are starting a big push basically did not register the actual high growth rates that the idea of a big push predicted. Planning was very, very difficult. Imagine India, for example, very, very difficult to do planning. This was after the Mahalanobis years, et cetera, et cetera. Inefficient SOEs, plenty of price distortions, all the work of Ann Kruger on rent-seeking activities in the 1980s. There was a shift of emphasis from the idea of capital accumulation, that was the basis of the models after World War II, to how it is allocated. And as I was telling you before, we went from, or they went from market failures into government failures. But what was important here is that difference in performance were attributed to the result of policies. In other words, a country, economists began saying and thinking that a country is poor, not because of its lack of capital, but as a result of the choice of policies. And this is very interesting because this is where we all disagree. This is where we all disagree. Is what are the right policies when we talk about development? So I'm convinced that this is true. The problem of developing countries is certainly those that reach middle income is not the question of whether the investment rate is 22 or 27%. And I say this because still in many of my countries this has been discussed, but it's a question of the choice of policy. This is absolutely fundamental. 1980s, Latin American the crisis, a total disaster. They were attributed to the region's populist macroeconomic policies, and suddenly all fiscal deficits appeared to be attributed to macroeconomic populism. In the 1990s, the extremely controversial Washington Consensus. If you read what Williamson said, is very different from what many other people said later on. The Washington Consensus, a term that continues being used today. And if you read the original paper that by Williamson, to be fair to him, nothing to do with what he was arguing, right or wrong. But the reality that you read the original paper is not exactly what some people are still claiming today. These were also the years of the much criticized IMF and World Bank programs in developing countries. Okay, very interesting. While all this was going on, nobody realized that there was a group of economists in Asia that they were doing very well. And this is when the World Bank published the East Asian Miracle that was extremely controversial, because it referred to 8 economies. These were Japan, Korea, Taipei, China, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, plus also Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, which were really far from the previous group. And the controversy was obviously that the World Bank needed a study, and they needed a study about getting the prices right. And this was extremely controversial because there was a group of economists saying, no, you cannot understand the story of East Asia unless you talk about industrial policy in the government. Not to mention this compositional story that you're mixing here. 3 economies far below, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, plus 2 cities. That is, come on, you're talking about 2 cities, all right? But they needed to construct the story of the East Asian Miracle. At the same time, do not forget, the 1990s, Japan entered a long period of stagnation, collapse of the Soviet Union, reforms in the PRC in India. All these had tremendous implications for those of us in the world of development. For example, the world's labor force increased by about 1.5 billion people. And by 97, 98, the story of the East Asian Miracle became, a lot of smoke, not clear there what it was. We can talk later about whether the countries have recovered or not, or they recovered during the last 20, 25 years or not. All right. So quick overview, as I told you, about the history of development. And I hope the way I have done it is minimally acceptable to most of you, so that I can continue. So, well, this is fine to talk about what we are today and points 3, 4, and 5, which is really the meat of the presentation. So what are we today? What are we today? And look, what I did is something that when I shared this with Antonio, thought that it was very interesting. I thought answering this question by way of 10 questions. What happens is that absolutely impossible to answer every single question here. We'll be here until tomorrow. So please take a look at these 10 questions. And what I am going to do is focus on the questions that appear in bold, 1, 2, 6, and 8. That is how development is understood today. How do civil servants understand development? This is somebody as a practitioner. I'm going to tell you what I go through almost every day. What remains of the objective of industrialization? Can services be today's escalator? And then you take a look at the other questions, and perhaps, Antonio, we can play a bit here a game and, this is the question here, okay? Which is, what about the role of the elites? What do they do in developing countries? Who is ultimately responsible for development? Like development, big capital letters, the same thing here, poverty, the use of industrial policies, global value chains, and what I put here in red, something very juicy, my views about whether this will be the Asian century or not. Okay. All right. So let me proceed with question number 1, which is, how is development understood today? And it's a continuation of what happened after 1970. Basically, development, the idea of a structural transformation, etc., is almost gone. It's almost gone. So development has come to mean a mix of, I'm sure that you have heard or seen this, poverty reduction, provision of basic needs, individual improvement, sustenance of existing productive structure. And all these ideas in different ways appear in the Millennium Development Goals, the Doha Development Agenda, WTO, obviously multilateral development institutions. All these ideas appear there. I don't think this has anything to do with development in a traditional sense. And much of it is what some scholars have called, I completely agree, palliative economics. And it really is very faulty because it lacks a vision of a structural transformation, which I think is absolutely fundamental. The consequence of all this is that it's very difficult to promote development this way. This has led to a list of uncoordinated initiatives. So my colleagues, some of my colleagues and I in the bank call a laundry list. And they are kind of a kinky development. And I'm not sure whether this term kinky development is mine. And I was thinking today, it could be Lamprecht's or it could be Hayun Chan's, but I don't think it's mine. Basically, but I love it. It's kinky development, a set of narrow interventions to reach the poorest of the poor in the poorest places. This is very, very different from how development economists were thinking about development in the 50s and 60s. Okay. So all this has led to, basically, if you go to multilateral development institutions, what is development? It's a purpur, it's a salad of things. Is a process of accumulating physical and human capital. Today you cannot, of course, education has to be there. You need to improve health, ensure property rights, and then somehow rational self-seeking individuals will really bring the economy. They will exercise the natural tendency to exchange, and somehow this will create a prosperous economy. Very, very different from what I was telling you that I believe development is. The confusion that this is Sweden and this is what we aim at. There is like you look at Afghanistan, Sweden, and then the transformation has to be somewhere there. Okay. The Millennium Development Goals, I do not want to spend much time on them. Absolutely, I think there might be some worthy targets there, but the idea of missing a structural transformation and the individualistic view behind it, I don't think they're really the way to go. Development is a social concept. I'm going to talk about it towards the end of the presentation. It's about increasing productive capabilities and productivity. And for my productivity to increase, I need yours. And this doesn't happen at the individual level. It's very, very, very simple. Okay. I think there is a tremendous confusion about goals, causes, symptoms, aspects of life that we might care about, but are not really development. And I have spent hours and hours talking about this thing with some of my colleagues in the bank. Okay. So this is basically what my view of what has happened during the last 25 years. Let me go quickly into the second question that I think is very interesting, and this is my view. I put here, how do civil servants understand or quite often misunderstand what development is about? And it's a tremendous salad of misconceptions. What they do, they go from one plan into another, and whatever they think is really a mess. I have summarized it. Well, first of all, growth, they don't even understand it properly what it is. And they go from neoclassical stories. So some of them really rehearse, and I go to meetings with them. I talk about changing the structure of production and exports. And after 20 minutes, they say, yeah, but you're forgetting that TFP matters. They have no problem with that. So they basically, they dribble you. You don't know what to answer. So they are at that level. Most of them are into the doing business. And there is an objective of increasing in the ranking, the World Competitiveness Report, or doing business, observe. And the other obsession is, of course, reforms. I'm not against reforming, but what I'm against is if reforms are go. There is a tremendous confusion. Just an example, when President Jokowi in Indonesia took over and won the elections in 2014, during the next couple of years, he came out with 16 packages of reforms, 16. If you go into each of them, I counted up to 39 reforms, 39. So a couple of years ago, I was very involved in Indonesia, I was working there, and I asked Indonesian authorities how they were doing with the reforms. They told me, of course, the reforms are not moving forward. It's impossible to do all this. Impossible. So what is happening? Nobody knows. The other day, a couple of weeks ago, I was called from another Southeast Asian big one economy that we work with, and I was asked, this was a very high ranking civil servant, can you explain what is the difference between a structural transformation and a structural reforms? Why? Because we are told that we need to do structural reforms. So this is the story. This is how civil servants think about development and growth. These are something that I cooked up last summer when I was giving a series of talks. It was in the context of COVID. There was a lot of questions about reigniting the economy, how to attain high growth and create employment. And this is part of the conversations that I was that I had with policymakers. They were sort of in an impasse. They didn't know what to do. All of them were admitting that monetary policy will not take them very far. It doesn't mean that it's useless, but there was the impasse of monetary policy. They realized that they had to use fiscal policy. At the same time, there was a tremendous fear in using it. Why? Because of credibility and reputation. Okay, the Standard & Poor's and company, they come after them. They realize that they need a development model. Then they have no idea what this model is about. So they spend their days thinking about what they need to get right to get development. And the conversations are along the following lines. We don't have enough savings, so we need foreign savings. And to do that, we need to increase interest rates to attract investment. We also have a fear of depreciation, and we need to reform a lot of things. This is a good time to reform. Don't forget that we need to do well in the World Competitiveness report, lower the fiscal deficit because we fear the rating agencies. Yes, we need that now. We need to increase, but sooner or later this will have to go down. And we need foreign technology and investment. So for this, we need to provide tax holidays. This is taken from a one single day conversation with policymakers. Okay. So what do? They are still thinking about the list, the laundry list that I have here to the list. They need to attract FDR, infrastructure, provide breaks, etc. Or they need to, of course, they're obsessed with increasing tax collection, liberalizing the economy, etc., etc. What does all this amount to? Is two things here. First of all, they have no power to control their own destiny. They're always thinking about what the rich economies will do to them or the international markets. They need the confidence of the rating agencies. They need technology. They need their savings. So this leads them to do what? Oh, a lot of tax holidays, high interest rates to attract investment, flexible labor markets always. It doesn't matter where. And fiscal retrenchment. It's a salad of these things. So all this amounts to what? To a very, very, very patchy development strategy. This is what I see very often with many in many developing countries and many policymakers. All right. Let me go into the third question that I want to address now in the minutes that I have, which is what remains of the objective of industrialization. And again, very little. Some developing countries ask about industrialization because they intuitively understand the relevance, but they do not know what to do. Some others tell you openly that they believe that their futures already lies in services because they realize that they will not be able to industrialize today. This is an issue of the past. Okay. Some of them tell you openly that no, industrialization is not the way to go forward. The reality is that the service sector is already the largest in both output and employment in most countries in the world, including developing economies. Plus the recommendations that they receive. We tell them, no, you forget about industrialization. This is the story of the past. Is you need to get into services. Okay. So what does my research show on this? It shows that all rich countries. This is a paper with my co-authors, Ashish Mehta and Changyong Ri, recently, Cambridge Journal of Economics 2018. All rich countries, manufacturing employment shares, they reach at least 18% between 1970 and 2010, and this was achieved before becoming rich. Okay, output shares are not as important. In other words, it is very easy for developing countries to achieve output shares, manufacturing output shares of 30%. However, none of them goes beyond 15%. When all advanced economies at one point manage to put 25, 30, 35% of their total employment in manufacturing. This is what we document. Okay, and by the way, they're not going to be able to do it anymore. Okay, but it's very, very interesting because in many developing countries they are still thinking about increasing the output share of manufacturing. We tell them no, it's not the output share, it's employment. Is employment. What they are, most of them are the 11, 12, 13% employment share. The inverted U curves for employment shares have shifted down and to the left, so that today the peak occurs earlier in a much lower share. Before it was around 30%, $30,000. Today is about 15%, less than $10,000. Again, This is not the case for output shares. They have really not shifted. Very interesting. I'm going to document this in a second. Manufacturing global output and employment shares have not declined during the last 40 years. So this question of deindustrialization, you need to be very careful, okay? Because I'm going to show you now, during the last 40 years, the share of global employment has remained at about 14%. It hasn't changed in 1970. So when we are talking about deindustrialization, you need to think about what are we talking about. And what has happened is that there has been tremendous international competition. And what happens is that manufacturing has really shifted from the advanced economies into the developing economies. That's what has happened. It's not a question of some people talk about a skill bias, technical progress, nothing to do with that, because otherwise the employment share would be much lower. It's the same at worldwide level. Which country has been the biggest winner of this shift? Employment in manufacturing out of the developing countries into the out of the developed countries into the developing countries? Of course, China has been the biggest winner of this story. Look, this is what happened to manufacturing output share. Okay, about constant at 16, 17% since 1970. It hasn't changed that much. And this is the employment share, also a constant. What is the big difference? That the share of the advanced economies has declined, if that of China has really increased. So what you have here is two opposing forces. Is the constancy of both value added and employment manufacturing shares implies that that global labor productivity in manufacturing has grown no faster than global labor productivity in the aggregate. Yet at the country level, we know that this is not true. We know that manufacturing labor productivity has grown significantly faster than aggregate labor productivity. So what happened here? Well, there was this story that I was telling you. As manufacturing labor productivity steam ahead of aggregate labor productivity within countries, this was counteracted by a continual movement of shift of employment in manufacturing jobs into developing countries or lower productivity economies. This is basically what was going on. And this is what these tables show. If you just focus on the left-hand side here, which is for the total period that I have, the other two are sub-periods, 1970, 2010, you will see that overall labor productivity, this is for the whole period, of course, is about the same, 60, 70%. No big difference, okay? What is the difference? That within regions, it has really been very, very high, but this has been counteracted by the relocation effect. It's very, very interesting. In the case of China, of course, productivity has been very high, and in East Asia for the whole period. But look at what happens in Europe and in the US. In Europe, it's very interesting. Zero total productivity growth in manufacturing, because the within sector effect, which is within region effect, which is very high, almost 80%, was counteracted exactly, counterbalanced by the relocation effect. In the US is a bit less, but it's basically the same story. So this is what has been going on in the world during the last 30 years. It's a tremendous relocation of manufacturing, okay? So what is going on in the world? Well, with advanced economies, basically it's a question of inequality. This is the most important implication. What you have is workers that are very, very well rewarded, and bankers, consultants, engineers, etc., and millions of workers earning salaries, much lower salaries. This is the implication of what is happening that I'm going to talk about it now, the type of structural transformation that is happening today. If this is what is going on in advanced economies, in the developing world, this is multiplied by 10. Because while after World War II, as I was saying before, and this is something that we document in our paper, the share of manufacturing, employment in manufacturing was very high in all advanced economies. In developing countries, this has never happened. Never happened, not even in China, which is the biggest winner. China, the most it has been able to do is to put 15% of total employment in manufacturing. When you go to countries like the Philippines or India, this is below 10%. So the type of structural transformation that we are witnessing today is workers leaving agriculture, living into non-tradable services or construction. This is really what is happening, okay? Let me get into the third question, which is, can services be today's escalator? And the answer is, I'm going to start going very quickly, Antonio. The answer is no. Maybe yes, but I really, really doubt it. Not only that, if we are talking about services, it will have to be modern services. But these are very similar to manufacturing with the same type of characteristics, etc. Not only that, they are a function of a well-developed manufacturing sector. You get into logistics, advanced logistics, because you have something to export. You get into finance because you need to provide working capital to your companies. So it's very, very, very difficult. So what is happening everywhere in the world, and this is even more so in developing countries, is that the service sector is the largest creator of employment. And what is very clear, and I was documenting that at the beginning of the presentation, is that employment is shifting toward low value added services, not the most technologically dynamic. This is my latest research with my colleagues, a paper that we just got accepted on the tradability of employment. So we ask whether employment has globalized during the last decades, and the answer is absolutely no, quite the opposite. The share of employment in tradable activities has fallen significantly in both advanced and developing countries, very, very, very clearly. I repeat, what are the sectors generating employment today? Non-tradable services, where productivity is very low. Many developing countries really believe that their future is tourism. So we really wonder, they think that productivity of waiters is going to increase, what it is going to come from. We document in this paper that the fraction of a country's, this is what we call export-induced labor demand, the fraction of a country's labor demand that exists to meet demand for its exports has really not increased. We use the input-output tables here. So basically you see that there is very little change between 95 and 2011. I repeat, this is the fraction of a country's labor demand that existed to meet demand of to meet the demand for its export. So similar to what I was telling you before with the story of industrialization, with globalization, what has happened is that globalization within industries has increased in some industries, but this has been counteracted by a deglobalization between industries. So it is true that in some sectors have become much more globalized. So, but these sectors have become smaller. So in the overall, really not much has happened. So that's why we conclude that no, there is no export. I mean, employment has really not globalized. We also measure the globalization of employment through the share of employment that is tradable. Okay, and here we do a very sophisticated, very, very careful analysis because we need to define clearly what a tradable sector is, etc. And no, it doesn't happen. Look, I give you the example of South Korea. We put here lower and upper bounds. I will not tell you how this is calculated, but basically what it shows is that this has been going down. This is all developing countries, clearly deglobalized. Clearly, they have not really globalized. It's absolutely the opposite. Okay, so out of 68 economies that we analyze, that we have good data for, 39 clearly deglobalized. In 29, we have in the category of ambiguous. But out of these 29, 18 are advanced economies, meaning that when we begin the exercise in the 60s and 70s, they already had very low initial tradable sectors, like for example, agriculture and manufacture. Okay. So given all this, why do I think that most developing countries are banana republics? And I here have a disclaimer. Obviously, no offense meant. I could have called them fruits, rye, cotton, or fused mineral republics. It's just that this is widely used. I think there's a tremendous lack of understanding among policymakers of key questions and answers about development and growth. Very few do associate their low wages and income per capita to the characteristics of the products that they produce and sell, the income elasticity of demand, the structure of the economy, etc. And they fail to understand quite often, this is my experience, that Germany's wages and income per capita are what they are because its workers make Siemens machines. They don't seem to really understand this. It is really the structure of the economy that matters, and not the ranking in the World Competitiveness Report. When I show them this picture, some of them really laugh and they say, well, this is very simple. No, the reality is much more complex. And I say, yeah, absolutely. It's much more complex, meaning like this. Okay, you want to disaggregate. This is from the Atlas of Ricardo Hausmann and his co-authors. This is the export structure of Pakistan, the export structures of Pakistan and Germany, completely different. And this is what they refer to, what they call complexity. As you see, Pakistan products to the left, very, very low complexity. Basically, it's textiles. my colleagues and I work on Pakistan 10 years ago, and we documented that the structure of exports of Pakistan had not changed since the 1970s. They were, and they are still exporting very simple textiles. They don't really understand the notion of complexity, that there is a tremendous difference and with tremendous implications between what Germany exports, the type of products and sectors, and the ones that I put here on the left, which are agriculture, natural resources, refining, etc., etc. Okay. So policymakers, as a result, they have a lack of prioritization in the annual plans that I talked about before, 2030, 2040, 2050, and they use what I call here the Christmas tree approach. It's about including anything. By the way, when you talk to them, everything is okay. Central bankers pray themselves for maintaining macroeconomic stability. Finance ministers say, or they argue that fiscal prudence is absolutely fundamental. You ask them about diversification, and tell, oh yeah, we have done all that. No problem, we have done all that. Okay. In my opinion, what happens in most of these countries is lack of a strong government, not in a dictatorial sense, that is capable of clearly outlining a solid development path in coordinating firms' actions towards a common good. This was the theme that I was mentioning to you at the beginning. This is clearly in a market economy, it has to be firms, but either you have something coordinating all this story, or it is an absolute mess, and that's why you don't see progress, or you see one step forward, two step backward. Okay. Why do I think that this situation is not going to change in the 21st century? Because I think I don't see leadership and understanding required to make a great leap. I put here on the right hand side some exceptions, and believe me, I have been debating this with myself for a lot of days before the presentation. I have no doubt the PRC has already proven it, with all the question marks that you want to put in the PRC about the future, about what is going to happen. But the PRC has really done it, shown that it has a real understanding. Vietnam, in my opinion, is very promising. And there are economies that I know well, I've been working on. One of them is the country where I live, the Philippines, that are in between. Indonesia, I know very well, and they're not at the same level of understanding, but very, very promising. India, I'm open. I'm sure that there will be in the audience those of you who know more than India. I have my doubts. Latin America, I have plenty of doubts, the same as Africa. There are a lot of discussions about the role of global value chains that I don't really understand. Unless the country has the muscle to attain foreign technology, global value chains are not the way to develop. Services and tourism, yes, like many other activity, but certainly not alone. Fourth industrial revolution that all developing countries are talking about today, complete misunderstanding of what these technologies are. The other day, I also got a phone call from somebody asking me if I could really get into a program helping a country really about the digitalization of agriculture, clueless about what they were really talking about. Okay. Catch up in the 20th century, yes, definitely I acknowledge that it happened, but do not forget that a part of this was within Rich Country Club, and also an important part was Asia. And even here it was driven by the 10% growth club. And do not forget, I assume Land has been able to join us, the Asia 40 story. This will not remain. This will not stay here with us, and we already know it. The 20th century drivers of growth are gone. Industrialization, I argue, no. We enter a period of some sort of deglobalization. Demographic dividend has been exhausted already in many developing countries. In technology, productivity, well, the first and second industrial revolution inventions are still there, but our countries are still thinking about the fourth industrial revolution, which I argue, in my opinion, is a matter of the advanced economies and the PRC. Developing countries most developing countries are at a different level. If there is still low-hanging fruit, there is urbanization. My opinion is the only big ticket for developing countries. So the fast global growth of the second half of the 20th century is gone. Some people I read recently that the possibility of developing capabilities to export knowledge-intensive services. Well, this is already happening, but it's very small, it's tiny. When somebody talk about Tata consultancy services or the BPO sector in the Philippines, very, very, very small for what these economies do need. So I don't think this is really the future. I close with what I think is possible today. And I really believe that this is a question of do it yourself or perish. Developing countries need to understand that industrialization continues being today as relevant as it was 60 years ago. But it's obvious that the industrialization that may take place today is not the same as that of 100 years ago. Absolutely correct, no problem with that. But that the idea of industrialization, the idea of moving up, the idea of transforming the economy, it continues being there. And also some form of industrial policy that we have not talked about it. I'm convinced that the market alone will not do it. The problem with industrial policy is that developing countries are really, they lack creativity. They lack creativity. I'm absolutely convinced. I have discussed this in many countries, and they really do not know how to use what the WTO still allows, which is much less than decades ago, but still the WTO allows to do some things. And this is being done by developed countries. Developing countries, they still really want to continue. Simply, they cannot get out of the story of giving subsidies, many of them, okay? So they need to understand, developing countries, really, that they need to get into products that and services that have these characteristics that I have here: increasing returns, pricing power, technological dynamism, dynamic rent seeking, and spillover. They need to find what these things are. This is what we call complex products in the parlance of language of Ricardo Hausmann and his co-authors. I insist that this is a question of do it yourself or perish. Policymakers need to understand it. We have not talked about the role of the elites, but they need to be much more committed than they are and really think about the common good, the nation, the idea of nation, much more than their own profits. And I really believe that development is something that has to be planned. Plan simply means thought of in order to reduce uncertainty, to think about possibilities, etc. And many things, as I was mentioning from the beginning, I've been mentioning, will not happen without a state intervention. This is the dilemma of moving at a snail pace or jumping. And jumping will require a state intervention. This is what I argue here. Given the importance that I give to employment as part of what I understand development is, and given what has happened during the last few years, in particular 2020, what we have seen, I see that the future of work, we have workers divided into three groups. I've been thinking about it very carefully in 2020. There's going to be a privileged elite, people like us who work from home. Then there will be a group of essential workers and millions of workers that are going to be excluded, and they will be fighting to survive. So I see a world a la Elysium. This is really the Greek mythology. Elysium is the place for the chosen ones in a world dominated by non-tradable services of unequal societies. And this is going to be even more so in developing countries. This is what I think is going to be happening in the 21st century. And for these reasons, I think that development is going to continue being a very messy story. I do not know if policymakers do understand what type of a structural transformation they can engineer in the 21st century, together with the elites. In the developing countries, they're very powerful elites that they control the large companies, etc., and they're into a different business. And I really believe that still many people will be left out. And that is why I argue that in most developing countries, well, they will still be waiting for Godot in the 21st century. And I close by saying that I hope I'm wrong. I'm going to stop here. I know that I want to be beyond the 45 minutes, but I really appreciate your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you so much, Antonio.
Thanks, Jesus. Thanks. This was a tour de force, but I think it was a very interesting way of combining both a discussion of theoretical development, how important it is, the conceptualization of what development is about, how we understand economic structure and productive structure in particular, and how all that has an impact in the way in which, of course, policymakers think about their role, their way of framing policies, and so on. Of course, these for people like us who've been working on these things for many years and writing about these things is very much the bread and butter of what development is about. Also, you pointed out how this is not common understanding. And in fact, this seminar is also a way of sharing that perspective and trying to probably, building on your last slide, cultivate a bit of pessimism of the intellect, but also optimism of the will, as Gramsci would have put it. Unfortunately, we do not have Land. We tried to reach him. Hopefully, he's all fine, and he didn't have any major issue. So we had a very big audience with very distinguished names I recognize there of scholars and young researcher. So I'm very happy to actually go straight to the Q&A session, if you agree, Jesus, and we can move from the presentation to more broader discussion. I would invite people from the audience. We have several people from different parts of the world to challenge Jesus in his analysis and his narrative and bring in their also perspective from different countries. So anyone who would like to raise questions or comments, please raise your hand or write in the main chat. For the time being, I don't see still questions, so we will wait for that while they come over. Oh, here we are. There is a first question from a colleague from Tanzania, Mohamed Barsame, who is asking, can you expand on the opportunities for Africa? And in fact, I would say your analysis, and for African Eastern people like me working a lot in Tanzania, South Africa, and Eastern Africa in general, there has been constantly this attempt to say, actually, Africa is now rising, it's not actually going down. And recently, Kunal Sen and other friends published this article around, the patterns of manufacturing development in Africa. So it's a very contested areas, right? Some people are more emphasizing the premature deindustrialization and pre-industrial premature deindustrialization. It would be very interesting to learn from you what you think about opportunities, not just the negative side of the story.
Yeah, first, this gives me your final words, Antonio. Give me the chance, just 1 second. I do not think my views about development are really negative. There's a tremendous sense of realism. I'm not saying that this is a disaster. I began by saying that development is by nature a long run story. The problem is for those who really thought that development is a matter of 10 years. And the problem is that is thinking that everybody is going to do it like South Korea. That is the problem. That is why I'm saying the standard is about 100 years. And that is what it took. And that is, we are getting into that, right? Having said that, well, the problem with the question, if I may say so, two things. I began by saying I'm not an expert on Africa. Second, it suffers from the same problem of Asia. What Africa are we talking about? My experience is I visited a couple of years ago Namibia, and they were asking me whether they could industrialize. This is a country that depends on diamonds. So you can imagine my answer. They didn't like it. What happens with other African countries that I have heard? These are things that you hear or you read. Kenya, Ethiopia, but these are anecdotes. What you hear here and there, growth. You have a couple of years where growth goes up, and then this is punctuated by growth going down. So I have not seen during the last 20 years a single case of an African country doing what some of the East Asian countries have done. And I'm not even going to say China, Korea, even Indonesia. Let me tell you the parallel. Indonesia was growing before the financial crisis, 97, 98, up to 8%. The financial crisis hit them in a steady, they really got a bonus. After the financial crisis until today, 5%. Of course, when they called me a couple of years ago, what they call ADB, the problem, the story was, can we grow by 7%? Why? Because this is what President Jokowi promised in 2014, that the country would achieve. Is there an African country that for 25 years has grown at 5%? Not a single one. So this is not to be negative, it's about being realistic. Is that what I have heard about some African countries, and really this is punctuated by my little knowledge of the continent. These are really a lot of anecdotes. I remember years ago reading something about Kenya, the story of flowers, going to the Netherlands. But I use that example from time to time, but not to talk about Kenya, is to talk about Alsmeer market in Amsterdam. That is the logistics and finance, etc. Then a couple of years ago, I heard about Ethiopia that is doing very well. Fantastic. Maintain this for 30 years and go for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 per capita income to 15,000. Then we'll be talking. I don't think my answer is complete, but it's based on my lack of knowledge of the region.
Thanks, Jesus. Let me try to collect a few questions because there are many now coming, and I would like to give a chance to everyone to hear your comments. The first one, sorry, I missed it before, asks, where do multinational corporations fit in this? considering that most trade is now intra-firm trade, can developing countries really contemplate industrial policy when they can't force multinational corporations to cooperate with industrial plants and therefore can't really influence in a great way what they can and can't export? Let me just give you another couple of questions here. One is potentially connected. Says, very insightful, I would like to ask what is Felipe's view on the use of state-owned enterprises for development. And I think this could be interesting in relation also to this engagement with multinational corporations and industrial policy. Would you like to address these two to start?
Yeah, let me start with the first one. The second one I'm reading here, I'm not sure, but let me start with the first one. Excellent question. I really love it. I prefer to give very clear answers. Instead of start fooling you with a maybe yes, but maybe no, maybe white, but maybe black, and you would start making faces. The answer is no, very clearly no. This is related to some of the points that implicitly I was mentioning. Is about upgrading, for example, through global value chains. The problem that most developing countries have in dealing with multinational corporations and moving up with the global value chains is that they don't give them technologies, very clearly. There is only one country, one developing country that has had the muscle to do that. Which one is that country, Antonio? China.
China, of course, yes.
Of course, is the only one. No other developing country. And this is a question that I have asked openly in some large developing countries. In large developing countries, can you do what China does? And they'll tell you openly, no, we cannot do it. We cannot do it. Multinational corporations to cooperate with industrial plants, no, they do not go to developing countries to do this. Absolutely not. All this business of moving up in the global value chain, I have never bought it. No developed country, what we call developed country today, and the last one being the East Asian, the Korean, Taiwan, did it that way. Hyundai built the car. This is not to say that there were no global value chains at the time. Sure, you always buy a screw from somewhere else. But the idea of building a car, and what we're doing now is discouraging developing countries to do it. And we tell them, you hook up into a global value chain and you move up. Tremendously difficult to do it. Tremendously difficult. I know the cases of Cambodia, for example, getting to the textiles, very difficult. Very, very difficult to get that. So I'm not optimistic that this is a route for development. What was the other question, Antonio?
This is related to the role of state-owned enterprises for development, starting from the example, of course, of China.
Yeah, this is a very, very thorny issue. In the bank, we are dealing with it. And in fact, what is happening in many countries is that there is a tendency, and this is related to the evolution of the idea of development, is to dismantle them and to change them. The reality, as I was also pointing out, there was a realization, understanding that many SOEs were very, very inefficient after the first couple of decades of development, and today there are a lot of questions. One of the big pending issues in China, I think there must be around 150, 160,000 SOEs in China, is what to do with them. And the Chinese government, is thinking about downsizing. So I think there will be a combination of many of them closing them down slowly, and some other them transforming them. But it's very, very difficult using SOEs for development. The way the fathers of development thought about it after World War II.
Let me try to, I'm trying to look at all the questions that are coming up to try to combine a few of them. I think some people who are less coming from a development background are asking if you could provide an example of what you mean exactly with transformational structural development in the context of the 21st century. And I think these questions also relate to your discussion around what is manufacturing, what are services that actually resemble manufacturing, or even, when we talk about advanced or industrialization of agriculture, what are those activities really that fit into the story of productive transformation, structural transformation? And of course, there is also a question that you might address in relation to structural transformation, which is, where is climate here? Where climate transition and climate change fit into your analysis of the development context. So I'm combining two questions that just came up.
Yeah, let me thank you, Antonio. Brilliant question. The first one, the second one, I know much less about it, but I'll try to talk a little bit. Two differences with. Let me answer by talking about the difference with respect to how the term industrialization was used decades ago. The first one is that I think today we have a broader view. You can talk about industrialization, you can talk about the agricultural sector, obviously, in the services sector. There's no problem in doing it. Why? Because basically you don't think about the product itself. You think about characteristics of activities. You want to get into activities of high increasing returns to scale that have pricing power. Let me give you an example. I don't have it here. Oh, this is pricing power. What is this? To you, this is a tie. To me, it's a very expensive tie, Fendi. Once you get into niches like this one, you have pricing power. You want to get into many products where you have pricing power. What is Siemens machine? What is an MRI machine? Pricing power. There are only 3 companies in the world that make fancy advanced MRI machines. So you need to think about this in these terms. Is about getting some sort of monopoly rents in the positive sense of the term. These occur in industry, in services, in agriculture. An example that I give often, I mentioned it before, was the story of agriculture. Is about do a survey of Alsmeer, the flower market in Amsterdam. It is anything but agriculture. It is about importing flowers from Kenya. It is about logistics. It is about finance. It is about knowledge. It is about identifying these activities. And this is the success of this is in the sense that we talk about development and structural transformation in the 21st century. So don't be just obsessed with industry in the very traditional sense of the term. The second question was more about climate change. It is absolutely everywhere. I have not talked about it because it is not my area of expertise. And I'm going to be very honest with you. And I appreciate that you asked a question. I have not thought about climate change until very recently because I didn't know, and because I was focusing on other things that I thought they were much more important. And it has been very recently, maybe during the 5 years, and even talking to some of my colleagues in the bank, that I realized of the importance of climate change. Very important in small island economies, for example. In some of our countries, when I have seen analysis, this is going to be a big thing in the next couple of decades that is going to affect a lot of their possibilities that they have. So yes, I acknowledge, and this is something that I need to get into to really incorporate it into my story of development in the 21st century. Absolutely, yes.
Thanks, yes, and I think it's fair to say that this is an area which is growing, and increasingly people are trying to understand what green transition means when we look especially at least developed countries where their contribution to emission is relatively limited, and where of course there are limited capabilities in terms of engaging with the type of energy technologies that are needed for that transition. There are a few questions here that I think are all about pretty much the policy and political economy of what you described, of structural transformation. Let me try to pull together 3 of them. The first one asks, how do you see the role of mission-oriented public policy in achieving the required structural transformation in developing countries? And do you see evidence of capability building and institutional change in developing countries that would enable these mission-oriented policies, especially in relation to implementation? And maybe you might want to address this question in relation to also another question, which is related to the underlying political economy, if you want, of structural transformation. An anonymous attendee says, my perception is that there is a significant correlation between successful cases of sustained structural transformation, industrialization, and authoritarian government, at least in the 20th century. Do you share this perception of what types of political systems are likely to most successfully drive 21st century development? And of course, this is a highly topical issue, especially when we look at African development. You mentioned before Ethiopia, Rwanda, or other countries where this argument has been raised. So we got to start with these 2, which are quite good and quite challenging as well.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, and thank you to the two questions. We could spend hours, days talking about these things. The first one, the answer is absolutely correct. What is the role of mission-oriented public policy in achieving? Is all of that is there, and this has been implicitly one of the big themes in my presentation. If I understand properly the question, during the last few years, I've had this big internal debate. There are a lot of people who talk about private sector-led development, and at times I don't really understand what people do mean. I began my presentation by acknowledging all the sins about governments, that they are bad, that they're corrupt, etc. Yet, after thinking about hours and hours, development will not happen without a state that has a, what you call here, I assume that, I hope I'm talking about what you mean, mission-oriented public policy in achieving a structural transformation. You have thousands of companies in any economy, in a market economy, what I call capitalism, and unless there is a big brother out there saying this is what we are going, it will not happen. The government of the Philippines, we're working with the government of the Philippines, or we want to work because this is stopped just because of COVID, has a program called Ambition 2040. And they talk to us basically about how do we make this happen. Ambition 2040 is about becoming a high-income economy by 2040. And we prepare a program basically about how to transform the economy, how to bring the notion of a structural transformation to the center of policy making. You forget that is the center of your policy making cannot be increasing or going up in the ranking of the world doing business. That cannot be. It has to be, you need to understand, you need to identify the type of activities that are going to do this. How do you do this? You need to talk to your private sector, because it is true that companies in the private sector do it, not you government, which is also misunderstanding that many policymakers think. They really think that development is about them doing it. And you say, no, once we accept that this is a market economy, it's private companies that are going to do it. But the role of the government is to coordinate all this and making sure that in 20 years you are there, which is, and this is the idea of planning. And this entails capabilities and institutional change, etc. It is about policymakers saying, yes, we need to reform 17 things, but we cannot do it. So what are the three key reforms? And the three key reforms that are going to facilitate a structural transformation. The other day, I gave a presentation here in the Philippines, and everybody understood it. Reform of the judiciary system, is it necessary? Probably yes. Does it have anything to do with transforming the economy? Everybody agree, probably not. So I said, take it out. It's not your priority today. Your priority is in 15 years, you want to achieve $20,000 per capita income. So you cannot do everything at once. So yes, absolutely fundamental. The other thing, I don't want to expand much more, but the question is very interesting, is one of the questions that I posed that has not been answered, the role of the elites in developing countries. And elites Walid, they live in their own world. I assume that you're from a developing country. So my feeling is that they live in their own world. Basically, the idea is to make profits, which is not bad at all, but they never think in the sense of what is the nation going, etc., etc. At the same time, the reality is that you see, if you look at the structure of manufacturing in any developing country, 99% of the firms are small or micro. These firms will not do what we are talking about. You keep that in mind. This is a process that can only be engineered by large companies. That when I talk about micro companies, I'm talking about two ladies making shirts. That's it. You have thousands of these companies, a repair shop, mechanics. That has nothing to do with this. This has to be big companies. Big companies. And the big companies are owned by the elite of the country. So either the elite really say, yes, I understand what you are talking about, or this will not happen. Super interesting question. What was the other one, Antonio?
The other one is more related to, sorry, I think I lost.
Oh, yes. The $6 million question.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. What are these cases? Successful cases, authoritarian government. well, you need to define an authoritarian government, etc. And I don't know whether you are referring to the East Asian economies, the Korea, the Singapore, etc. We tend to deny this. No, there have been many other cases, really, in a different way. Of course, you need to hear, say exactly what are these countries that you are talking about. What types of political systems are likely to be most successful drive? I still think that is democracies. Of course, we can talk about here degrees, etc. But I think democracies are really make it. I don't really think that is a. I don't really believe that this is when you do the econometric analysis properly. I don't think it is a question of authoritarian government leading industrialization and transformation. I think this has been discussed by some authors and some papers. The question of South Korea for a couple of decades, in Singapore and in Taiwan. I don't know what other cases are there. No, I disagree with you in this case.
I think, yes, as you mentioned before, when I found interesting the first part of your presentation, that there was a phase where fundamentally the good governance agenda started developing as the main paradigm, right? And all the doing business and all the things attached to that are part of that broader agenda that sees certain type of institution the driver for economic development and transformation. And so in a sense, the causality relationship between where good institutions or capabilities come from was sort of lost, right? Many of these countries managed to develop what we call, more democratic, inclusive institutions out of long processes of transformation in the productive structure, in the participation of the political elite and the political economy into that process. So to a certain extent, it seems to me that you are criticizing a bit of that good governance agenda that imposes a certain type of vision of what a model of economic development is about. And as a result of that, has easily identified a certain type of governments in a way or the other.
I need to think about this. It's very difficult to establish some sort of causality here and see what it is. I was listening to you and I was thinking, of course, the countries that I know the best, the East and Southeast Asian economies. Again, the story of Korea, Singapore, but also I was thinking about the other three cases, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. Indonesia is a democracy today. I mean, with all the question marks that you may put, people go there and vote, etc. I think some scholars have done work on this, and my recollection is the answer is no. The answer is no.
It's a pity Lant is not with us, because Lant Pritchett, of course, has worked on this issue of really the political economy of inclusive society. And
I wish you were with here to elaborate on what I just said.
There are plenty of more questions, so I'm just trying to get one or two for you. We have a few minutes left. Of course, people seem to be very interested on the implementation of what you're talking about, right? So, for example, one question is about how can you implement these policies when the political cycle is so short. So we are talking about, countries. There is a reference here to the European Union, and in broader terms, countries in the periphery of the European Union. You have something to add to that? It's a question and a comment, I would say, at the same time.
Yeah. Very, again, super interesting question, and an issue that appears in our discussions, the questions of political cycles. In the Philippines, for example, it's a very interesting story. The Philippines is a presidential system, and people vote. This is a democracy. People, you might not like it, you might have a lot of problems with the president or the system, but it's a democracy. But to prevent what happened during the Marcos years, the president can only be there for one term, 6 years. So there is a lot of this. And when we began talking to the Philippine government, when we were preparing in 2019 what to do, we were talking about minimum 20 years. 20 years. So this somehow contradicts the idea that there are elections in the Philippines next year. There will be a new government. So we're thinking about what to do. But absolutely correct. Very, very, very difficult to do this transformation in less than 20 years. What I often tend to argue is that there must be a minimum set of things, minimum set of ideas that no matter who is in government should really understand. Because some of look, what we are talking about has nothing to do with what you think about politics. Is saying my idea is that average income per capita in 15 years in my country go to $25,000. And how do you do that? Well, what you want to do is to change what you produce and export. But that should be accepted by every government of every country. So what are the three reforms that we need for this to happen? Which companies are going to get into this? How are you going to get into this? This is going to be in the smallest steps, or we need to develop a couple of sectors a la Singapore, biopolis. In 20 years, they went into bio, nano, blah, blah, blah. And this should be accepted by governments of every color. This is what we are trying to tell them. And some governments are open to it, and some others says, look, when we get out of here, we do not know what is going to happen. And the reality, again, be very honest, is that there is a tendency to start all over again from scratch. Because
I think in this case, right, we know from the work of scholars like Peter Evans, for example, that it's always this relationship between the political. When we talk about the government itself is quite fragmented, right? The political economy is made of different actors. So sometimes these lack of continuity is also manifestation of lack of coherence or cohesive type of political groups that are actually able to support the transition. As much as we see, I mean, I'm myself working a lot in some of these countries, you see lots of policy fragmentation and disalignment of policies, and we realize that this is not really because they don't know that they should align these policies, let's say technology and skills policy, but that ministries operate in silos, and they try, of course, each of them to protect their budgetary allocation and think more in terms of their own areas of policy more than the overall package of interventions that are needed. I think there is one last question I would ask you, and then I will make a final remark for the next events. Should development agencies and institutions prioritize building capacities of policymakers and governments? Is your belief that the catch-up required today is more knowledge-based? The very last question.
Should development agencies and institutions prioritize building capacities? We do it, of policymakers and governments. Yes, and we do it. This is a big, we spend a long time doing that, up to a point, and I don't want to trap myself with the question of the white man's burden. Much of my time goes on this. I'm very, very careful when I talk to policymakers because I don't want to fall into the story of the white man's burden going there and lecturing. I realized years ago that it takes a long time to learn about development and talking to policymakers. Not all of them are ignorant. Some of them are very sophisticated, as sophisticated as you and I can be. So let's not misunderstand this. But at the average, no. And you feel this, in other words, when I talk to policymakers in the Philippines and Indonesia, no, these people are very sophisticated. Let's not misunderstand. But you go down and then you really feel it, the next level. Very, 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 it is very clear. So institutions like mine do this. And I know some of my colleagues do an excellent job. Some of my colleagues share my views about development and structural transformation. And I know for a fact that they spend hours and hours dealing with it. So we do it. You're asking me, is your belief that the catch-up required today is more knowledge-based? Yes, clearly yes. There are a lot of sophistication. Yes, absolutely yes. Yes, this fits in very well with the previous question before about really understanding the type of structural transformation that is going to happen in the 21st century. It's really about understanding. This could happen in products and services. It's about really understanding activities that pay $50,000 wages. And one of them is this one, because this is what this is designed. Antonio is laughing at me. I'm really
I'm laughing. Yes, I remember the first time I met you was at UNIDO in Vienna 11 years ago, and I think you made the same example about the tie. But the tie, I was trying to remember if it was the same tie. But I think it's a very effective example because I remember it. So
the tie in my Mont Blanc collection. So when when I show my $1,000 Mont Blanc, I ask people, what is this? And everybody says it's a ball pen. And I said, no, this is a very expensive Mont Blanc ball pen that for somebody like me who spends the day thinking about these things means 40,000 euro salaries in Germany. That is the one. But this is the way to think about things, is what activities are going to give me eventually 10, 20, 30, 40, $50,000 wages. This is the example the other day when I was talking about the Philippines is, do you think that the income per capita, you think that German wages, German workers make more than you Filipino workers because they are taller or because they are more handsome? The joke is, of course not. They make substantially their salaries are substantially higher because there is a significant number of them working in Siemens, in BMW, and in Mercedes. And this is the ones that are really pulling the wages of the economy. And today there is plenty of knowledge behind all these activities. So yes, the catch up required in the 21st century will be knowledge based. Absolutely.
Thanks, Jesus. I think we have covered, again, I'm very sorry that Lant was not able to join. I think we have covered quite a lot of ground, and some of the questions, of course, were also challenging some of the points. And I think this is an ongoing conversation. We will have further events on these type of topics. In April, we'll be having a 2-hour session with Ajun Chang and other colleagues who contribute with me to a special issue which just came out in the European Journal of Development Research, where we very much addressed a number of similar topics, the one that Jesus discussed today. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks, Jesus, again for your talk. And we will be again together next week for another seminar. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, everyone. A pleasure. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you.